Okay, we're coming back now to talk about water management on a mixed organic farm. I've got Ryan, the questions that were posed to Ryan, and we're gonna kind of go into a bit of a panel discussion after this. And so we'll try and do the same thing here with questions for Henry and Francis. So Henry is a research scientist with the AAFC in Brandon. He's been working there since 2011. He conducts research on hydrology, nutrient cycling, and steam ecology of agricultural systems. His current research is focused on developing knowledge to reduce eutrophication and flooding problems in agricultural watersheds. He's doing work on sustainable and resilient production systems and understanding potential environmental benefits and trade-offs associated with agricultural management changes. He earned his PhD from the Watershed Ecosystems program at Trent University in Ontario and was awarded a postdoc fellowship through Yale, through the Yale Institute for Biospheric Studies before coming back to Brandon to work for AAFC. And Frances is Henry's mom. She's been farming organically for the last 20 years, a mixed cattle and grain system near Kenton on a New clay loam. They experience some excess moisture as well as moisture shortage conditions, and so they have some challenges with the resilience of their organic production system, and that's what made them maybe a good fit to try and talk here today. They work as they've got some livestock. They include perennial hay and pasture in rotation with annual crops, do some strategic tillage, relay cropping, intercropping, surface water retention, and conservation of natural features. So thanks to both of you for joining us. I'm not sure if we got Frances on the Zoom here yet, but we're going to work to get her in. And if we don't, Henry's recorded some of her thoughts, and I think he's going to play that for us here at some point. So we'll start with you, Henry. You can take it away, and we'll go to a bit of a panel in 20 minutes or so. Thanks.
Sure. Okay. Well, I'll jump into that because I put a video together, I guess, of an interview that I condensed down to 20 minutes. I had kind of a free-ranging conversation with Frances about sort of around this topic with some leading questions, and with the idea, or I wanted to get a bit more of her perspective, and I've just interjected a few pertinent research results, I guess, sort of throughout that. So I'll just get the screen share going here. And I'll just try and share the video. Okay.
There you go. Looks like it's gonna start working here.
All right, I'll hit play and
not to talk too much, just ask questions and interject from time to time with some relevant research results, but mainly I'm going to try and get Frances's perspective on implications for water management of the practices that she's been using on her farm and has been kind enough to let myself and colleagues like Aaron Glenn do research on.
To provide some context to start with, I've brought up a couple maps. The first one here just shows the location of Frances's farm. The yellow square on the map indicates the location just north of Kenton, on a little over half section that's on Newdale clay loam soil. Zoomed in on the farm, it's fairly easy to see the trees, the pasture, and that about 50% of the arable acres were rotated into forage in the 2021 imagery shown here. But I've added some letters just to make note where it's a little harder to see some of the water-related features that Frances and I are going to chat about. The D's note places where there are surface depressions. There's some letter R's where there's some constructed water retention. And there's the one place where there's TD that notes some tile drainage features that were added behind a water retention structure to increase infiltration where it's meant to be a dry dam.
Start talking generally about the history of management practices that you start out farming with, tillage, rotations, stuff like that?
When I was farming conventionally, we tried to zero till so that there wouldn't be so much of a problem if it was windy and dry. And then the wet years came along, and sometimes it wasn't so great, but I transitioned to organic, and tillage became a whole nother ballgame.
And over the last 20 years of organic production, what kind of changes have you made on the farm?
From conventional to organic, I transitioned, and I started having a lot of forage land, and I found that I could sell some forage if I didn't need it, but it was better for my land than just trying to have an annual crop every year. And it controlled the weeds, and I made a genuine effort to get at least 3 wide grassed runways running through my farm and through the pasture, and I left the potholes alone, and the sloughs that were in the fields, and I also tried to make more use of a damming system where the water could be let go a little bit more slowly.
So obviously your tillage increased when you moved from no-till to organic with tillage. So where does tillage fit into your production system as a tool?
Right now is when you break up your alfalfa ground and you put some manure or compost on it, and then you try to get your crop in there in the spring, and sometimes you'll have breakthrough alfalfa, but there's worse things than alfalfa to have breakthrough in your crop. And then in my grain fields, I till in the fall and try to leave stubble there, like you don't work it all in. You try to leave stubble there, and then in the spring you do what you have to do and try to make yourself wait until there's a few weeds or volunteer somethings coming up, and then do your pre-seed tillage and hope that you can get a nice seed bed there where the weeds aren't going to be competing too much and you can get a crop germinated.
Good point for me to share some of the results that we've seen related to tillage implications for runoff and infiltration of water. I don't really have a graphical result that's ready to share on this, but in general, what we do see is that when we look across fields in Manitoba, the snowpack size in the spring is mostly about how much snow fell, which isn't that surprising, I suppose. But the other factor is the presence of stubble or plants in the fall that increase snow retention. I guess something that I wanted to highlight in the context of fall tillage, beyond just some retention with stubble, is that we see less runoff from the snowpack and more infiltration where the surface is left rougher. So with lots of what you might call micro depressions where water is likely to pond. So more water is retained where tillage maintains aggregates and doesn't totally pulverize and smooth the soil, and in comparison to totally smooth no-till. Okay, I'll jump back into the interview. Sometimes I see cattle on mixed farms mostly confined to riparian areas and acres that aren't suitable for cropland. I guess I'm wondering, are there parts of your farm not part of your beef production?
My fields have the potential to be grassed or fed to the cattle.
I did a rough calculation from the air photos of your farm, and it looks like about 30% is under permanent tree, grass, or wetland cover. A lot of that is in your pasture, but you've still kept maybe 15% of the non-pasture acres that could be cropland out of production. I guess field operations would probably be easier without those areas in a lot of cases, particularly those low spots, I would guess. So what lets you keep those areas out of cropland?
I don't have huge equipment, and so I can work around potholes and ditches and things like that. And I may not like losing the acres to it, but if those areas are just going to erode when it is too wet, then they might as well be staying there and I might as well be baling the grass. And when it's too dry, there seems to be a little bit of, I don't know if you call it residual moisture, but there's some moisture there.
I'm sure it wasn't part of your land management planning, but we have noticed that over larger watersheds, like those larger than 200 kilometers square streams in the area, there are benefits for water quality and less downstream impacts during flooding events when natural areas are maintained in those. So I'm just going to try and jump over into floating head mode here to show some results from that study.
So this figure shows the main effects from a model predicting total dissolved phosphorus and total dissolved nitrogen concentration for 21 streams in the Westman area. The contours indicate concentrations like in a topographic map, and then the x-axis shows flow and the y-axis shows cropland area. What's really interesting and I think encouraging for conservation efforts here is that there seems to be a threshold around 30 or 40% of the watershed remaining as grassland, trees, or wetlands, above which there ends up being continually higher concentrations of nutrients during larger runoff and flooding events. But in those watersheds with more natural areas remaining, there's actually some dilution happens and concentrations are lower at high flows. And I mean, that's likely at least in part because those areas receive less nutrient input from outside the watershed, but they're also more likely or potentially more effective at retaining those. Or I guess I could have just been more concise and read the paper title, Natural Land Cover and Agricultural Catchments Alters Flood Effects on Dissolved Organic Matter Composition and Decreases Nutrient Levels in Streams.
We haven't really done a lot of drainage or channelization to move water off the land more quickly. So what do you do with those areas that are wet and in your cropland acres?
You can work through them. Go ahead. Because you're not going to lose your soil moisture or lose your soil from there because there's nothing, unless you get a flood, it's not going to wash out of there. And so you might as well work through them if you can.
Are there some benefits in wetter years to having a rotation on your cropland acres that include perennial forages?
I think so, because usually your forages will suck up the moisture and just grow up.
Have you noticed fewer challenges in wet years when you've grown intercrops? Is intercropping easier with less competition for available moisture?
In the wetter years, cereals grow, like if you're intercropping peas or barley, and you'll find that peas maybe don't do as well, but I think that if it's a reasonable amount of moisture, then the cereal uses some of it up and the peas survive and climb up. But if it's really wet, then the peas don't survive. And lentils don't do really well in a wet year. Like I've tried various intercrops like flax and wheat, and they didn't mature at the same time. And Ryan, Harry Vetch, and I planted hemp and seeded red clover underneath, but you need to be pretty sure you're going to have a wet year if you're going to do that one. And the Ryan, Harry Vetch would do a lot better, but one of the things about intercrops is you have to have an end use in mind. And I don't have seed cleaning equipment.
With this year being a dry one, I have noticed a lot of landscape modifications and drainage work happening on farms around you. Do you feel any kind of financial pressure or other issues pushing you to make changes?
I think it took me a few years to get so that I was accepting of I've got what I've got, and that sometimes you have to wait to get to certain areas to seed them.
So I know it's tough to predict the weather, but does moisture condition play into your decision about when to grow forages?
With the hay crops, I try to have a 3-year rotation, and with a perennial hay, if it's too wet, it's really hard to get it cut and dried down and baled so that you get good quality for the quantity. You've got nice quantity usually. But then In a dry year, you have usually pretty good quality.
What kind of differences in productivity for your annual crops do you notice in different landscape zones of your fields during a dry year like we had last year?
I had peas and oats this summer, and in the low spots, the oats and the peas did quite well, but in the high spots, the oats were very thin and the peas ran out of moisture and they wizened up and dried.
Practices that you found to be really effective for adapting to drought conditions?
There isn't a silver bullet, and I hope that we don't have another year like last year, because it's really hard on organic farmers in particular, and conventional farmers too. But it's hard on your financial health and your mental health too. Nobody likes to see their crops withering up and dying and be worried about how you're going to feed your animals or water your animals.
Okay, I don't want to be insensitive to the challenges that we had last year, but I'm going to change the topic slightly to keep the interview going. And I think we've mostly been focused on farm in terms of impacts of practices, but I'd like to move into a little bit of discussion about potential impacts on water quality downstream and for nutrient losses that drive algal blooms and eutrophication. Do you think that organic production has a beneficial role to play in reducing nutrient runoff?
Hope that some of that would be stopped because it wouldn't be leaching, and I doubt that on organic ground that there's a whole lot of P&M that are leaching out, because usually our soils are woefully lacking in
the network that we have in Manitoba. It looks like your suspicion, at least for phosphorus runoff, is mostly true in that we do see that lower availability of phosphorus in soils at organic fields, but at the same time, there tend to be reduced runoff losses. The plot that I have up to show you on this slide summarizes average runoff phosphorus concentrations over multiple years of observation across those fields in Manitoba, so with wet and dry years. And some of the organic fields are the only ones that consistently have runoff in the concentration target range for the Red River defined by the International Joint Commission, although it's probably not a completely fair comparison of surface runoff to river concentration targets, since there's going to be some groundwater inputs and other sources of dilution as you move downstream. I've modified the figure a little bit here just to show the organic sites with red points on the plot. And that said, there's those low organic sites, but fields with manure application to build soil phosphorus. At those ones, we do see potential for higher phosphorus losses from organic fields too. Although with the use of tillage and incorporation of manure, those ones we haven't seen the same type of stratification of nutrients near the surface as we have with some of the other forms of seed place fertilizer without incorporation that we've observed. Now there's some nuance here in that soil phosphorus is for the top 5 centimeters, which isn't usually where we're testing for a little bit deeper depth. And there's variation in with wet and dry years. But I'm not going to go into a whole lot more detail right now. The general trend and the resulting trade-offs between fertility and potential for higher runoff concentrations are fairly obvious, and it's kind of a matter of finding that sweet spot, I guess, in terms of sustainability. Before I get back to a few more questions, it's probably important that I also mention that we do see a similar effect in natural areas on farms as well. The results that are up on this slide are from experiments we did to test the ability of riparian areas to retain a pulse of phosphorus in runoff during experiments that was similar to what might be received from an upstream field with high concentrations during snowmelt. The x-axis indicates soil phosphorus measured at an experiment site, and the y-axis is the rate of phosphorus uptake from nutrient release experiments. Squares are for snowmelt, and dots are for when we went back to these sites during rainfall runoff events. And some of the results are from experiments that were on runways or buffers at Francis's farm. Where riparian areas and buffers are receiving less phosphorus loading in runoff and fertilization, and so haven't had the same kind of accumulation in the soil, there is retention of dissolved phosphorus from runoff, and so it's more likely in those cases. So overall, it's a function of soil phosphorus and soil chemistry, because all the sites have comparably high calcium and magnesium. So really, it's how much phosphorus is there that's changing the potential for absorption. And I think overall, harvesting those low areas for hay and not adding phosphorus as fertilizer when it's an area that can be feasibly harvested, or when you're is likely an effective approach to improve water quality, since runoff is going to bring new nutrients in with it from upland areas anyway.
How much of an issue do you think phosphorus limitation versus water limitation in a drier year like we had last year was?
Alfalfa crops or hay crops this summer were way down in quantity. And is it because they're low in phosphorus, or is it because there was no moisture?
Okay, so I can't resist bringing up at least one slide with preliminary results from my colleague Aaron Glenn here, just because the data set that he shared with us is really interesting. He's been measuring ecosystem carbon fluxes and eddy flux with eddy flux systems at 2 of Francis's fields. And the time series here, where it's showing negative flux, that indicates productive plants and carbon fixation. And then where there's increases, that indicates respiration, release from plants in soil. So in general, there's more carbon uptake with the perennial phases in these rotations, you can see, with even little blips showing up when hay was cut. But to connect this back with water management, why I wanted to show this here is that there has been a fairly major change in productivity measured as carbon fixation across all the crops on your farm, or on Francis's farm, over the last couple of dry years. So it looks like overall a lot of carbon's being added here, but this balance doesn't include removals with harvest of grain and hay that leave the field. So I need to say that Aaron mentioned including losses of carbon with harvest for these fields more or less brings it into balance, since that productivity scales with plant productivity, or yields do. So as interesting as it would be to dig into the carbon side of things further, it's a little off our main topic around water management. I don't want to steal Aaron's thunder either, so I'll leave it for Aaron to give a more detailed analysis in the future about potential for carbon sequestration and losses.
I only got preliminary results so far, but I think specific to the alfalfa grass productivity that we were talking about, the answer regarding what was limiting productivity over the last couple of years is probably both phosphorus and water. With those preliminary results, we did measure lower yields due to dry weather in parts of your field with and without, in that case, application of struvite as a phosphorus source in an experiment. And last season, there was a bump in yield where more phosphorus was available, even though there was an overall reduction. So it'll be really interesting to see whether this is more pronounced in a year with greater soil moisture and maybe more microbial activity, or healthier plants are better able to use what water was available. Okay, our discussion has been fairly wide-ranging, but hopefully we've stuck with the intention around the session with a focus on water management. And I think we'd better save some topics for discussion with the panel. Thanks, Francis, for letting me put you on the spot with this interview, and to my colleagues who shared some of the results that were presented. And I need to note that I have cut down a lot of material from a much longer interview with Francis, so I'm going to say you can contact her if you want to have a more in-depth discussion about the practical aspects around water management and her experiences, or just say hello when we can have in-person meetings start up again. With regards to research results, feel free to talk to me, or if I don't have a good answer, I can put you in touch with colleagues leading the micrometeorology or agronomy sides of some of the linked work to water management and organic systems that I was presenting on.
Okay,
So I think I stopped sharing there.
Yeah.
Yeah, obviously I'm not a professional video maker. And just, some of the transitions seem a little more awkward when I watched online. So but,
No problem. I think the message was received. So yeah, thanks very much for putting that together and for talking to him, Francis. I think that that helped a lot. So I guess we'll go into our panel discussion here. I've got a list of some of the questions that came earlier on that I'll maybe try and run through real quick. I guess thanks, Ryan. A lot of my work with Manitoba Habitat has been focused on restoring drained wetlands, and you gave us a pretty good reference there early on. I think wetlands have been a pretty common theme here, but in listening to both of you guys talk, Ryan also spoke about that the kind of shallow wetlands program that a lot of the conservation districts or the watersheds have to offer. And there were more than a couple of questions that came up in the chat that kind of said, who do we talk to get more information? And I would direct you to your watershed district. And if you're not sure who that is, I'll point you to maybe throw a question to Ryan, or you can talk to me in the chat or whatever after we're done here. We can get you talking to the right people. And yeah, Francis made a comment about the value of those shallow wetlands, especially in a drought year. Ryan showed that picture of the Timothy that was growing well after that water recedes. And I think in most situations, that's the program that the watersheds have come up with is not that you need to set them aside, and we kind of heard Francis allude to, well, in a dry year, cultivate through them and you might get a crop out of them, and I don't know that there's anything wrong with that. And a lot of the conservation organizations out of the States have gone down that road to say, not that you need to seed this down to a perennial, and that's a good thing if you can make that work in your system, but just don't drain those shallow wetlands. And they've seen some good results come out of that. So I think that was kind of something I heard from both you guys. Yeah, so that was Jen McComb and Mark Rivard kind of asked where do we get more information. Mark Rivard spoke about where to get some permaculture going, and yeah, I think I would have you talk to your watershed there. Ian Robson threw out a comment just about reinventing PFRA, and I think it came from Ryan's talk about a bit of a lack of access to trees that's been going on. He's used Farm Resiliency Agency, and I don't know if either of you have some thoughts on where that might come from, or kind of, yeah, that shift back to getting some more public funding for trees. Yeah, Ryan, you mentioned that 2 million trees program, so I don't know if you want to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I can't really speak to it too much. There is an application in play right now at both Manitoba level as well as a couple of different national organizations. It does seem to be a multi-year program. So the 2 billion tree program is going to span multiple years. And I think the intent from our end of it is that we will provide trees free to producers that are willing to plant. So, I mean, when we cried foul in 2012, 2013, when the Conservative government decided to scrap PFRA, we all wrote letters of protest. And I think the government of the day's belief was that the private sector would step up and provide trees. And at a fairly reasonable cost. I priced out a shelter belt, a half-mile long shelter belt this morning, and you know, it's $4,000 or $5,000, and the tree is a small component of that, really. When you start doing land prep, and if you're fencing them off and putting a weed barrier down, that's where it gets a little more expensive. But $2-3 per meter, I guess, would be probably a fairly average price to plant a belt.
Yeah, good. So not a huge, I think the investment there, you should be able to recoup that before too long. I know we've shifted, or we've put a lot of shelter belts in at our place as well too, and I kind of justify them the same way that you do, that a little less evaporation, so we're better able to trap some of the neighbors' snow that they let blow around, and have a little more moisture available during the growing season at our place. So I think there's lots to be said there. Henry, I appreciated that kind of segue to talking about carbon, and I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but yeah, I think like Ryan talked about soil health, and I think I've become quite interested in it too. What do you see as kind of some of the reasons to go down that soil health road and carbon? I mean, I think there is a market developing, and there may be some opportunity to capitalize on it to some degree, but at the end of the day, in my book, if you can put more carbon in the ground, you're increasing your resiliency, and I think that's what we were kind of hearing from your talk. Yeah, I don't know if you want to talk more about kind of some of your results on increased carbon and how that might affect production.
Yeah, a lot of that's my colleague Aaron's sort of specialization. Certainly there's potential links, and a lot of talk about the potential for changes in soil organic matter to impact the hydrological properties, water holding capacity, that type of thing. Some of that's kind of established, and some of it's maybe there's some questions what it means when we scale it up. But either way, even if it's not, I guess I think I can say for most sites that we look at, and Aaron could speak better to this than me. We're pretty close to, we might improve the soil properties, but in terms of the overall carbon balance, sort of the impact on the global carbon balance, carbon cycles, we're the best sites we're more or less close to being in balance. If it's annual crop production, we're not talking about a perennial area. So some of the solutions, or some of the sort of getting paid for sequestration, might be more challenging than we'd hoped, kind of from a producer's perspective. But there's really good reasons to build your soil organic matter either way, right? Just from the soil properties, fertility, that side of it. So I don't want to. I'll stop there before I get too speculative.
Done. Ian Robson's doing the right thing, and I think I should have mentioned this. If anybody's got a question, just pop your camera on or throw your hand up there, which I think you do in the bottom with that reactions button on your screen for those of you that are watching there. So Ian, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, regarding the PFRA, briefly, Ryan, PFRA far more than tree shelter belts. It was concerned about water and tracking wetlands and a whole host of other beneficial management practices and management ideas and assistance too, right directly to farmers, mainly on the Prairie. The Farmers Union has proposed a Canadian Farm Resiliency Agency. You can read about that in our Tackling the Farm Crisis and the Tackling the Climate Crisis report. And that is something that would be important to actually get a handle on and assist farmers with their concerns over water and soil and rotations, and that helps everybody, organic or non-organic. And no, the photo in the background is not baled snow. Thanks.
Right on. Okay. I don't know if either of you guys have any further thoughts to that, but yeah, thanks for clearing that up. I think Ian, that's a good way to get some reading in.
I was gonna say, I won't say too much because I'm obviously not an official departmental spokesperson or whatever, and when it comes to PFRA and sort of what's happened, but certainly many of my colleagues who I work with on water related issues were previously with PFRA and are still within AAFC. There's maybe a bit more research and a little less on the programming side, but I think there has been rebuilding of some capacity over kind of in recent years around water, and we've had a couple of new people start in Manitoba with AAFC with some focus in that area, and when it comes to some of the connections with on the carbon or climate change file, that side of things, certainly that's something that is a priority in our mandate letter, and there's programming coming through that along with that. Doesn't negate that there's sort of a gap left from PFRA, and certainly my colleagues would suggest that too, but it kind of is, many of those areas are recognized as priorities as well. So I guess I'll just leave it at that. And there are some programs that will be coming along or that are there. So hopefully it's a positive in that sense.
Sure. We got a comment in from Sid Jones about working across the slope of the field to try and spread the water out. I think it was similar to what Ryan showed with that kind of key line design to try and move that water around and not let it find the gully and run away real quick. I think there's huge value in that kind of soil sponge that Ryan mentioned, and I wonder if you guys have some ideas on kind of the practices that you feel might work well, that you might piggyback together on an organic kind of cropping system to increase that soil health and try and store a little more water in the soil. So I'll leave that with you. Whoever thinks first can speak first.
I'll maybe just, because it ties into some of what I was talking to Francis about, maybe just one comment and sort of something that surprised me when we're measuring runoff from some of these fields or across a range of fields, not just organic ones, being that there is that relationship with soil roughness, or the roughness, kind of the similar idea to going across the, or opposite to the direction of flow kind of thing, and creating those contours. But even just at that really small or fine scale, kind of having those little depressions, it does make a difference. Like, so if two fields have the same amount of soil and one's rougher, we're seeing less water leaving in the spring, right? So it's sitting there and infiltrating. The trade-off is, right, you need to retain some snow probably. And I think there was work, like older work, like before my time, even being in research, right, where there was a focus on how do we retain snow and have that add to soil moisture, and some kind of combination of shelter belts are one area we talked about, but having some areas with stubble, taller stubble, and some areas where there is a soil surface created that promotes infiltration. I think there's room for those kinds of systems, and it'd be pretty interesting to see a little bit more around that. Because I think it doesn't have to be all one or all the other as far as tillage goes. There might be some ways to do it strategically around water management, kind of just based on some of the patterns that we've seen with where water's going in the spring.
Ryan, if you had any thoughts on kind of practices that worked well, or that you could see fitting into an organic system?
Not that familiar with the organic systems. I do, like yesterday when Dr. Bork talked about having to sequester it or grow it before it's available to be incorporated or brought into the carbon building system, kind of was an interesting concept. I think everybody should be thinking about that. Like, we do need to grow this material before we can either incorporate it back in or just have it in the system to be converted. And also, I was listening to a presentation the other day where both these producers were talking about their own experiences and discussed the idea of stripper headers. One fellow had adopted use of stripper headers, and the other fellow was interested in it. So that might be another way of trying to like leave more biomass in the field to be there for conversion or for armor, or shading of weed, reduction of weed growth and all those kinds of things.
That's that's an interesting point on around stripper headers, because some of the fields that have had the, the largest snowpack certainly are that we work in. Some of the producers we work with have stripper headers, and it's kind of amazing how much snow is retained in some of those areas, and particularly sometimes where maybe there's some areas that were packed down and some areas where the stripper header was used, and there's those gaps in between that just completely fill up. So some combinations, say, of a stripper header in some areas where there's tillage or whatever to promote infiltration might be pretty interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think for those interested, we just heard about different commodities and markets and where things are going. I've had some really good luck with the stripper header in flax. It seems like that's the way to combine flax as far as I can tell. So anybody that's interested in doing that, I would encourage you to give it a shot. I think I was probably on the same webinar as Ryan based on what he just said, but I think that was Monday. The fellow that had adopted this stripper header was really advocating for a green plant growing into the fall as a means to improve infiltration, kind of that late fall moisture and the snow runoff as well. And I wonder if we've got if any work's been done that kind of compares the value of stubble versus a green plant. And I guess the reason I ask is I do like to do my fall tillage after the crop comes off. And I lose most of my stubble or my standing stubble anyways as a result of that work. But I think there's probably some really good potential to increase infiltration through seeding that green plant after. And it's pretty easy to get discouraged when you see this little 2 or 3 leaf oat come up and do its thing and it freezes. But he was kind of saying he anecdotally he felt like it made a huge difference in terms of how much water was getting into the soil. So yeah, I wonder if either you guys had any thoughts on that, because I guess, yeah, if you go back to those soil health principles, that's one of the really big ones, and I think it's one that we could do a better job of adopting as organic producers, is that living root more of the time kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know if there's if that makes sense to you, that do your tillage and then get something else growing there might do a similar thing, or might even be better than having that stubble and the root channels, the old root channels there.
Yeah, I don't. It seems like there's trade-off from my perspective, or what I see. It kind of depends on the year. Like in a dry year, it might be easier to, I don't know if establish is the right word, establish stubble than it is to establish a crop that's kind of going. And so that's always, in terms of thinking about sort of water management, that has to start the season before. Not being able to predict the long-term kind of conditions it's always a challenge to sort of suggest, like, well, I'm not going to suggest somebody doesn't want to retain snow, but then sometimes those fields are pretty hard to get into if they're really wet, that sort of side of it. But with the living, like if something's established, then the trade-off is in the spring, it doesn't have to be, or if it's say something that might overwinter, the trade-off there is that living root, then it's ready to go right in the spring, and you don't have to worry about those field operations.
Yeah, I think that helps. We got a question about carbon from Dave Rourke. Ryan, you kind of alluded to something, or you didn't allude to it, you said it there, that you need, if you're gonna put carbon in the soil, you need to be able to grow a plant. And I think when we're short on fertility, sometimes we're really limiting ourselves in terms of what we can put in the soil. And so if that's looking at some of the phosphorus products that Michelle and Joanne talked about yesterday, I think that might be what we need to do, even though sometimes that kind of goes against the thought process that a lot of us subscribe to. I'm working on a perennial program to that's main goal is to store or sequester carbon. And I think we're going to use some kind of phosphorus fertilizer, and we need to include legumes to grow some nitrogen to drive that system. And so Dave's question was around, say our native soil in our areas was at 10 or 12% organic carbon. Is that where we should be shooting to get back to? Like, is that kind of where we can get to again? What have you guys seen in the science or in your communities as far as where are we aiming for?
So, I mean, I was on a call this morning with a producer from Redverse that says he has taken his soil from 2% back to 8%. 10 to 12 is kind of what the literature says was available or was there like prior to cultivation. I find it hard to maybe fathom that we'll get back to that, considering the practices that occurred before cultivation. I mean, you listen to the stories about the grass was as high as the horse's back, and that majority of that grass was probably being cycled every year, or at least was being produced and then available to be cycled. So the 10 to 12 could be probably a lofty goal, but dare to dream, right? Like, why wouldn't you set that as the goal? And if you fall short, well, you still tried to hit it out of the park.
Yeah, I'm tempted to say too much because it's not necessarily my main area, but probably even like Ryan says, it's good to have a goal in mind. Even trying to maintain a balance and not continue to lose organic matter is probably a benefit in some cases too. It gets really complicated when we start to get into sort of comparison against historical or tracking change, because the depth to which we sample makes a big difference, and where plants' roots are going, and it's a lot easier to build up right at the surface. Being a water quality person, I always kind of think about a practice and trade-offs. If we're building up carbon just right near the surface, mostly, we're probably also building up things like phosphorus right near the surface, and sort of the potential for losses can increase. A lot of times, some of the, if I look at literature where there have been really big changes, or even some of the sites we're looking at big changes in soil carbon, it's usually when there's some import of material in some way, say like bale feeding, these kind of things where you bring in a feed source, and of course there's carbon coming into the system. It makes a difference. And in organic systems, it is a positive or a good thing on the carbon balance. When we're adding manure, it does bring quite a bit of carbon back in, but then any sort of the net benefit or the net change to the carbon balance, it's kind of have to think off farm as well. So there's things that that meter comes from somewhere, right? And then usually there's material that leaves the field. So in terms of, that's why it's complicated, I guess, in terms of the perfect fix or the solutions. It's there isn't just sort of something that we can prescribe, right? But I'm not going to ramble anyway.
Yeah, no, right on. I think that's the right attitude. Is if you gotta bring something in to drive that production, that's gonna kind of leapfrog and get you into a different ballpark, then I think that's what you have to do. And if that's manure or what have you, I think it can do some really good stuff. I just see Frances made a comment about kind of cross seeding, and that she feels like water runoff or less runoff, more infiltration, therefore, and better germination. So yeah, I think that kind of expands upon that idea earlier on. I'm just reading Grant's thoughts there. Mark Newman, Karen keeps reading my brain, she's getting ahead of me always. Mark Newman was asking about issues with animals in that your 12-inch culvert there, Ryan, and some of your drains to draw down those big dam projects. Do you have issues with wildlife, I think is what he's thinking?
Oh yeah, for sure. So like what you didn't see was we do put beaver cages in front of those structures. for the most part. And summer students every once in a while do get in there and fling some stinky mud around if they need to. It is definitely an issue.
Right on. Karen had asked earlier, it was about kind of, we haven't seen that Mark Shepard keyline system in the province. I don't know, do you guys have thoughts on if you're setting something up, what were the things that you'd really want to shoot for in a system like that?
I wanted to do something on my place, but I kind of talked myself out of it. I don't really have the topography. I think we need a little bit of topography. So like up into the Rossburn or even in the Shell River watersheds now that we've expanded. I hope that there's somewhere up there where we can play with even just a couple of contours and a water holding structure, a basin, just to kind of have as a demonstration site where, you know, we could intercept water that's going to come off of a contour and be channeled into a retention site.
Anya, I don't know, Henry, if that resonates with you. I think I agree with you, Ryan. I've looked at it too, and we have less slope than you do. I think if we do a good job with our soil sponge, we negate the need to worry about that kind of keyline system. But yeah, for those that feel like they can't get that drop of rain to get into the ground where it lands, and it's going to want to run somewhere, if you kind of feel like that's your situation, then I'd really encourage you to kind of look into that Mark Shepard type system, that because then I think there's huge gains to be had by managing that little bit of water that's going to run off otherwise.
Yeah, I always, when I look at it, I always kind of wonder about, and it really depends farm by farm. We're maybe already starting to talk about it, but kind of what's the cost benefit for a producer, like in terms of the input or the requirements to set something like that up, and then ongoing labor, that sort of thing. There's a lot of stuff. Maybe this is kind of segues into something broader I've been thinking about too. There's a lot of practices that are easier to implement when it comes to sort of features on the landscape, natural areas, if there's cattle in the system. It's a little harder sort of when we're talking about acres that might have annual crop production, that side of it. So kind of some of the trade-offs, or what some of the benefits in an annual system, I mean, or challenges. I struggle with that sometimes when we're thinking about, okay, well, talking about riparian areas, wetlands, more natural areas, those watersheds where we see that tend to have cattle, right? But are there benefits that we can promote kind of for the annual crop producer that doesn't have cattle as well? Or, you know, or is it making connections between farms? And I know some of that's going on too, but.
Yeah, I think, go ahead there, Ryan.
I was just going to add too, I think there's a barrier in the sense that we're just wet enough here that we don't really go through enough dry years to feel that pain. I think that keyline system was probably developed in a bit more of an arid environment where water is year after year a very limiting factor. So it's just that much more of a valuable resource to capture and manage better.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely right. It seems like we get dry and talk about it, but next year we'll go back to normal and everybody will start digging ditches again. So I wonder, you just said something interesting to me, Henry, about the lack of livestock in some areas, and I tend to think that's a mistake. Like I think every part of the province has acres that are better suited for perennials and are likely better suited for grazing ruminants. And yeah, I wonder if you guys have some thoughts on how to fit those animals back into cropping systems, like where you see some big holes that were, I don't know, like we quit photosynthesizing. Our wheat crop is pretty much done photosynthesizing in July, and there's this huge window after where I think there's room for livestock to come back in. So I don't know if you you have some thoughts on that you'd like to share. But yeah, I think we got to find a way to bring grazing livestock back in all over the province. Not say they're for out west and I don't need to have them.
I think that your water and fencing infrastructure are pretty big barriers, and it's a mindset. I wasn't really aware of it until I got talking to a guy that I know, but there's quite a hierarchy of grain farmers don't obviously look at livestock producers like at the same level. I think that there's a bit of an issue there culturally almost, where they don't want to deal with livestock. They think it's beneath them. They want to go away for the winter. So there's barriers of infrastructure, which I've daydreamed about having a portable truck with a water system where you could roll out and have fences around crop fields and water all in one go. And really try to work with a couple of guys, you know, to put those two operations together. Because I think the benefits of integrating livestock are pretty big.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, you go.
Oh, I think the water source is an important point, and that almost dealing with that or having a way to develop water sources might be as much a limiting factor as anything for some of the integration and cross farms. And I'm just going to point to the link that Karen put in the chat. I think that type of approach to try and find ways for farms to work with each other is probably a really important aspect that's got to happen if something's going to scale up. But the one I kind of alluded to it in one of my questions, maybe it was a biased question to Francis, and one of the caveats or concerns that I'd have too, and we talk about sort of making sure there's cattle on the landscape, and part of conservation efforts is, depending on the price of grain, there's always an incentive to just cram animals into or not marginal, just cram them into smaller spaces. Like, it's good to make you know, to be able to maintain those areas and have some dollars from those acres, having them as grazing acres. But if it's there's so almost, or I don't know what the right word is, being careful, almost have to be careful not to have those areas maybe are more sensitive, kind of get too many animals in them for their carrying capacity kind of thing. So maybe it's a long way of getting to the carrying capacity. It's being something important to keep in mind, probably, because we can do more harm than good if we go too far in that direction.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a line that they don't have to cross. And yeah, there's been some pretty good technology increases in that fencing end of things, and I don't see the fencing as being a real obstacle anymore with some of the stuff. And I think the watersheds are probably there to help out with some of the costs of that stuff to get animals onto grain land in the fall. But yeah, I think the water is a huge obstacle you got to think about quite a bit. But no, that's good. And yeah, Grant put a comment in there about in those kind of rolling areas where you got some wetlands. Probably you don't want to do it year in and year out, but I think there's a good way to make use of some of those areas that feel like they're being left out. And yeah, Dave made a comment about the economics of cattle, and that's yeah, I've gone into cattle myself in the last 4 or 5 years here, and it's just hard to believe how little money is there. All the really good cattle producers have to be so frugal, and I'm not good at that all the time. But yeah, that's got a lot to do with it in my mind too. It's just there's no money unless you're doing something real different. So I'm at the end of my questions. I don't know if there's anybody else in the crowd. I haven't seen any hands up, and it could be that I'm not seeing it. So feel free to speak up if I'm missing you. But otherwise, yeah, we got a few more minutes if we need, and if we don't need, then I think I'll excuse you early.
The Grant's comment about the rolling grain lands kind of tweaked my mind a little bit about sort of a broader issue in terms of when we're going right back to when we're talking about inputs potentially, or the need for inputs and phosphorus. We have pretty uneven, or we tend to have uneven distribution, particularly in these rolling landscapes. We don't usually talk about, you know, precision organic kind of that sort of idea, or at least the sort of the spatial aspect of it. But that is something we definitely see when we look across landscapes on some of the organic farms that we work at, that there is uneven distribution, particularly with carbon and phosphorus between the low areas and the high areas. You know, some of it's historical, and there's things like erosion that have happened, and some of it's they don't under yield, and sometimes have gotten manure or grazing, that kind of thing, in wet years, and there's accumulation there. So when it comes to making use of, sort of like not impacting water quality negatively, but also making use of kind of limited resources, there is a lot of, I think, space to think about that kind of approach of targeted applications. If we're talking about inputs or even targeted grazing or whatever our practices might be that are going to impact soil properties. So it's, I mean, maybe I'm just plugging it because I'm like, this is a good area for some more research, but it is worthwhile thinking about. Maybe it's kind of what's old is new again. We're talking about you know, putting manure at the hilltops, that kind of stuff. But
yeah, I think there's lots of room to unroll bales or do bale grazing on those eroded knolls too, and try and reduce that amount of, we're all there for the most part. I'm doing more tillage than I wish I was, and so we're increasing that likelihood that we're overloading the low areas and we're stripping the high areas. So yeah, I think it's an area where there's some good potential for mixing them up. Laura's appeared on the screen. I don't know if she wants us to.
Yeah, I had a question for Ryan, Scott. In your presentation earlier, Ryan, you had a range of 50 to 100% on your farmer funding for various conservation projects. Can you comment on that range and how decisions are made, and when you would pay somebody 100% to do a project versus half?
It comes down to social good or public good. So for the water retention, we typically do 100%. If there's a real benefit, if somebody's trying to line up an irrigation source or something to that effect, we may ask for a contribution. But typically water retention is funded 100. Now that, having said that, the landowner does usually supply clay material or rock materials. So we write that into the cost, right? So there is a bit of a in-kind contribution there from a landowner. But everything
is that just is that your district, or all of them do that?
That's our district. I don't know how many other districts do a lot of small dam building. It seems like we're kind of unique in that sense. But that's not exclusive. I mean, there's some of them obviously build water retention. But for the most part, all the other programming probably starts at 50-50. And then if we can argue a pretty strong public benefit, or if there's some set aside land where they're taking land out of production or doing something to provide, you know, especially if there's a recreational water source involved or something like that, then the cost shares will go up. But it's pretty hard. We're delivering several programs from several different funding sources. So it is pretty much like a one-off. Like, you got to look at each project individually to figure out what the cost shares are going to be.
Yeah, I'm just trying to wrap my head around how farmers access conservation district funding, and maybe you can comment on this too, Scott, from your funding. Do farmers have to kind of be proactive and go out and figure what they want to do and then shop it around, or how does it work?
So for us, we've kind of totally went that way. We've gone from having like 8 or 10 set programs to a letter of expression where the landowner can come up with their project and discuss the merits or the benefits, both of them, and to, you know, is it improving water quality at a larger scale? And that's where our starting point is. It's kind of like, wow, it's wide open now. It's like you use your imagination to come up with a great project and argue what you think the cost share should be.
Yeah, I would say the same thing is kind of the direction we've gone. We do have a set suite of programs, but we're spending money from so many different sources. Like the Westons give us a bunch of money, and we get money from the feds and money from that pot that Ryan spoke about earlier that came from the province a few years ago. And there's different goals with all of it, but I think if you had a pretty good idea of what you want to do, go talk to the conservation group, whether that's DU or us or any of the watersheds, and I would be willing to guess that if you've got a good project that's got some societal benefit to it, you'll find somebody that's going to help you out with a cost share at least, and if they won't pay for it, kind of thing for you. So yeah,
Is there a place for a farmer to go to find all these programs in one place, or they just have to know where they are?
I think the watersheds are your best bet. I think more often than not, that's where you're going to find it and have a little more flexibility. And they know what our programs are. So if they can't do it, or if you're looking for a longer term easement or something like that, they'll point you towards us, I think. So yeah, that'd be my starting place. But all of those groups, like I used to go around and knock on doors, and we don't do that anymore. We wait for people to come to us. So yeah, I think the contacts are online or we're out floating around. So come find a representative of one of those groups, and we'll be able to talk you through what you need to do.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and I would echo the same thing. I've sent guys to Ducks or to MHHC, depending on the program, and if they phone here and talk about a project, I can put them in the right direction, whether it's us or one of our partners.
Yeah. Right on, Kate. Well, we're right at time, so I'll cut us off there. But thanks very much for your thoughts, Henry and Ryan and Francis for participating in all this. That was very good, I thought.